On January 4th, 2020, mi mamá went to heaven to be reunited with my baby sister. She was only 52 years old. Mi mamá grew up in a small village in Mexico and watched her parents struggle. At a young age, she and her sisters tried to bring income by selling tortillas at the nearby mercado. They'd come home with a few pesos and many bruises. Some of the other girls who sold tortillas would pinch their arms or pull their hair to get them away from potential customers. My grandmother would beg them to stay home, but every day they'd disregard the bruises and kept going back. Eventually, mi mamá moved to the United States on a work visa and pushed an ice cream cart every day in the scorching Arizona sun. She missed my grandmother dearly, but focused on sending money back home from the little she made. They say be careful who you fall in love with, but she tried to see the good in everyone and fell in love with a thundering storm, full of lightning and pouring hail that threatened to extinguish her spark every time she shined too bright. As the years passed, her family grew and she focused on all of us to keep her strong even when times were tough. Recipes weren't a thing at home. Sometimes we had food in the refrigerator, but most days we had none. Yet somehow my mom would always find something to cook. The nameless dishes were a delightful concoction of random ingredients made with love and creativity. We'd lick our fingers every time. As a kid, I didn't notice all her selfless acts right away. But as I got older, I noticed she'd make caldo and fill our bowls with vegetables and small pieces of meat or chicken while she stood at the stove making fresh tortillas. Once she knew we were all full, she'd sit down with her bowl of leftover broth. It rarely had any of the other ingredients. Without a word, she'd simply dip her tortillas and happily enjoy her caldo. If there were any leftovers, she'd pour them into her own bowl and fill her tummy that way. When I finally began to notice that she'd do this every meal, I'd constantly check the olla to make sure there was enough vegetables and meat for her, and whenever there wasn't, I'd say I was full and set mine aside for her to enjoy. I think she knew I was lying because she'd urge me to eat more and say, "Con que ustedes coman, yo me lleno." As long as you eat, I will get full. This was the type of person she was. She had nothing but would willingly give someone in need the clothes off her back. I remember seeing her face concentrate as she did math in her head at the grocery store to make sure she had enough money to purchase food for the week. We were not to interrupt her while the cashier scanned all of the items because sometimes she would miscalculate and be a few dollars short. I'll never forget the look on her face as she asked to leave some things, watching her eyes scan all over the items, knowing each one was needed but understanding we couldn't afford them all. "Muchacha, discúlpame, pero necesito dejar un garrafón de leche." She had this innocence and purity about her that never faded even as she got older. One time, we were walking to the car, and as she scanned her receipt, she realized they hadn't charged her for a gallon of milk. She promptly turned around and went back to let the cashier know because otherwise her conscience wouldn't let her rest. Another time, we'd stopped at the grocery store on a chilly winter night. We were walking to the car when a homeless man approached us. He said he was cold and hungry. She didn't have any money because she'd just spent it on the week's groceries, but she gave him her jacket and told him she'd be more than happy to share some of our groceries. He took them and thanked her. As we were pulling away, we saw him leave the groceries on an empty cart and walk away. Mi mamá kept working and eventually saved up enough money to buy an ice cream truck. She'd wake up at the crack of dawn, load up her merchandise, and return home once the sun went down. Summers were both a blessing and a curse. The arid desert heat brought more customers to her ice cream van, but in turn also made her a target for those who decided it was easy to steal from the quiet 4'11" woman. If she was lucky, they'd only take merchandise, but she wasn't always lucky, and a hard day's work was gone in a few minutes. Mi mamá worked until she couldn't work anymore. There were 6 of us kids, but she lost my baby sister and talked about her constantly. She'd tell me of the dreams where she pictured her little face and what she would have looked like. When I was in middle school, she began to get more sick and spent 3 days a week in a dialysis center for several hours. She dreaded going there and always came out feeling sick and nauseous. I would sit in the waiting room until she was set up, then stay by her side to translate and alert the nurses when she got worse. The hospital visits became more frequent and I soon memorized the hallways. I'd be dropped off after school and wait for her to wake up so she wouldn't feel scared or alone. If she wasn't in the ICU, sometimes I'd be allowed to sleep next to her bed. I always wondered where her strength came from, because the first thing she'd do when she finally woke up is give me a weak smile and ask if we were okay. On the days she wasn't at her dialysis treatments, if she was well enough, she'd spend her time volunteering at food banks. She never got to finish school but dreamt of becoming a doctor someday because she wanted to help people. That dream was not possible, so this was how she helped. Her evenings were spent at church. The services always felt so long and the music was loud. but I could always make out her voice. She was tone deaf and her claps were always offbeat, and I loved that about her. I could always hear her singing at the top of her lungs as she closed her eyes and raised her hands. Now it feels like the years flew by, but back then they crawled at a snail's pace. Each day I saw mi ama's physical health deteriorate, and I knew she was tired, but she kept fighting for us. That fight lasted well over a decade, and eventually her mental health began deteriorating as well. During her last months of life, she got to complete a dream she'd had for over 20 years. She went back home and saw her mother one last time. A few pictures capture the radiant smile on her face of a woman finally at peace. Unfortunately, with a thundering storm around, peace never lasts for very long, and she was soon whisked away to a place where cold, jealous hearts mistreated her and mocked her for her physical health and skin color, where the storm could hail down on her with no one around to protect her. Mi ama remained strong until she returned back home, but her health continued declining. On January 4th, she took her last breath and left this earth to be reunited with my baby sister. I know she's happy every time the sun shines brightly. It's almost as radiant as her smile. And this ofrenda, it comes from the garden grown in her honor. She loved plants and for years told me of a dream she repeatedly had where she saw my little sister in a garden she could not enter. Today, I work in this garden and hopefully one day I'll join her in hers.